Have you ever felt completely invisible in a room full of people? Have you ever poured your heart and soul into something only to be cast aside by the one person who should have championed you? Our story begins with Clara Hayes, a brilliant historian standing on the edge of her dreams at a glittering gala. But in a world of wealth and power, her brilliance is ignored, her presence dismissed. She is about to retreat, her spirit crushed, when the most powerful man in the city does the unthinkable. He stops the world from spinning, takes her hand, and introduces her to everyone as his fiancée. The air in the Astor Hall of the New York Public Library was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was a heady, almost suffocating perfume that clung to the velvet drapes and settled over the constellations of diamonds adorning the necks of the city's elite. For Clara Hayes, it smelled like a world she was only allowed to observe through glass. She clutched her small borrowed clutch, the faux leather slick beneath her nervous fingers. Her dress, a simple navy silk sheath, had felt elegant in her small apartment. Here, under the celestial glow of the chandeliers, it felt like a school uniform. She was a sparrow that had accidentally flown into an aviary of peacocks. The evening was meant to be her coronation. For 3 years, she had worked as the junior research fellow under Dr. Alistair Finch, the museum's celebrated curator of medieval manuscripts. It was her painstaking work, her discovery of a series of coded letters hidden within the binding of a 14th-century psalter that had become the centerpiece of the museum's new exhibit. It was her triumph. Yet, her name was nowhere to be found on the glossy invitations or the grand placard at the exhibit's entrance. It simply read, "Curated by Dr. Alistair Finch." Alistair, she'd said, her voice small in his cavernous, book-lined office 2 days ago. The placard. It doesn't mention my research credit. He had peered at her over his gold-rimmed spectacles, a look of weary impatience on his face. "Clara, this is how the world works. It's about the institution, the figurehead. Your contribution is noted in the academic supplement. That's what matters for your career. Tonight is for the donors. They need a single authoritative name to attach to their generosity." Now, across the hall, she watched that authoritative figurehead in action. Alistair was holding court, his laugh booming as he regaled a circle of benefactors with the story, her story, of the discovery. He gestured with a flute of champagne, his words painting a picture of his own singular genius. He hadn't looked at her, spoken to her, or even acknowledged her presence since she'd arrived an hour ago. He had introduced her to no one. She was a ghost at her own feast. Each time a new guest approached his circle, a knot of hope would tighten in her stomach, only to dissolve into the familiar acid of disappointment as Alistair's gaze slid right over her. She tried to catch his eye once, offering a small, hopeful smile. He met her gaze for a fraction of a second, his expression blank, before turning back to the banking magnate beside him. The dismissal was so complete it was like a physical blow. Humiliation was a slow, creeping cold. It started in her toes and worked its way up, chilling her skin, tightening her chest. She retreated to the periphery, finding a small alcove behind a marble pillar. From here, she could observe without being observed. She watched women in designer gowns that cost more than her annual salary laugh with practiced ease. She watched men in bespoke tuxedos discuss mergers and acquisitions as if they were trading baseball cards. It was a complex, intricate dance of power, and she didn't know the steps. She didn't even know the music. Her phone buzzed in her purse, a text from her sister, Chloe. "How is it? Are you the belle of the ball? Send pics." Clara's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She couldn't bring herself to type the truth. "I'm hiding. The man who built his success on my work is pretending I don't exist. I've never felt so small in my entire life." Instead, she typed, "Amazing, so glamorous." The lie felt heavy and shameful on her tongue. The guest of honor, the evening's primary sponsor, had yet to make his grand entrance. Nathaniel Sterling. His name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was a titan of the tech industry, a man who had inherited old money and multiplied it 1,000-fold with ruthless, visionary brilliance. The entire new wing of the museum was named after his family. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, and his presence tonight was a coup for Alistair and the museum board. Clara felt a bitter irony. Her work, her passion for the quiet, forgotten voices of history, was being funded by a man who represented the hypermodern, fast-paced future. An hour bled into another. The champagne soured in her stomach. The polite laughter began to sound like screeching. The beautiful faces seemed to morph into grotesque masks of indifference. It was time to go. There was no point in staying, in torturing herself with this public execution of her self-esteem. She set down her untouched glass of sparkling water, the condensation leaving a perfect ring on the linen-draped table. With her shoulders hunched, she began to weave her way toward the grand exit, keeping her eyes fixed on the cool, dark promise of the city night beyond the doors. She just had to get past Alistair's group. She ducked her head, hoping to slip by unnoticed. And the sheer intellectual fortitude it took to connect the ciphers was, if I may say so myself, a career-defining moment. Alistair was pontificating. Clara's heart seized. He was taking credit, not just for the curation, but for the very act of discovery, for the late nights she'd spent with a magnifying glass until her eyes burned. The eureka moment when she'd realized the key wasn't in the letters, but in the musical notations on the opposing page. A hot, furious wave washed over her, momentarily eclipsing the shame. She stopped, turning to face him, a protest forming on her lips. But what could she say? "Excuse me, that was me." They would look at her, this nobody in a navy dress, and then at the celebrated Dr. Finch, and they would simply laugh. As her courage failed, a sudden hush fell over the hall. The ambient chatter dipped, heads turning in unison toward the entrance. A man stood there, framed by the marble archway. He wasn't particularly tall, but he possessed a stillness, a gravitational pull that bent the room's energy toward him. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone, a look of casual disdain for the formality of the event. His hair was dark, his features sharp and angular, and his eyes, even from across the room she could feel them, were a startling, piercing grey. Nathaniel Sterling had arrived. Alistair immediately abandoned his story, his face splitting into a sycophantic grin as he moved to intercept him. But Sterling's gaze wasn't on the approaching curator. His eyes swept the room, dismissive of the fawning faces, the hopeful smiles. They moved with a cool, searching intensity. And then they stopped. On her. Clara's breath hitched. For a dizzying moment she thought she was imagining it. But he was looking directly at her, his expression unreadable. The entire room seemed to follow his line of sight. And suddenly, hundreds of pairs of eyes were on her, the girl hiding by the exit. The ghost had become visible. Nathaniel Sterling took a step, then another, moving with a silent, predatory grace. He bypassed the sputtering Alistair without a glance. He walked straight through the sea of parted bodies, his focus unwavering. He walked straight to her. He stopped a foot in front of her. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. He smelled faintly of bergamot and cold, clean air. "Clara Hayes," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, quiet baritone that cut through the silence of the hall. She could only nod, her throat constricted. How did he know her name? He extended a hand, not for a handshake, but an invitation. Hesitantly, she placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, warm. He turned, facing the stunned, silent crowd, his hand still holding hers. He found Alistair Finch in the throng, his grey eyes turning to chips of ice. "Finch!" Nathaniel Sterling's voice resonated through the hall, clear and sharp as breaking glass. "You have a remarkable talent for overlooking the most valuable assets in the room." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a public condemnation. Then he looked back at the assembled elite, his gaze sweeping over them all. He lifted Clara's hand slightly. "My apologies for our late arrival," he announced, his voice ringing with indisputable authority. My fiancée was just feeling a bit overwhelmed by the crowd. The silence that followed Nathaniel Sterling's declaration was not empty. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and sound out of the grand hall, filled with the thunder of 1,000 unspoken questions. Fiancée? The word echoed in the cavernous space, ricocheting off the marble and gilded ceilings. Clara felt the weight of every stare, every bewildered, calculating glance. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion, a white-hot panic that erased all thought. Alistair Finch's face was a grotesque canvas of shock. His jaw was slack, his complexion had turned the colour of spoiled cream, and his eyes, wide and disbelieving, darted between Clara and the man holding her hand, as if he were watching a tennis match played with live grenades. The banking magnate, the society dames, the museum board members, they all wore the same expression of stunned incredulity. In the space of 10 seconds, Clara Hayes had transformed from a non-entity into the most fascinating woman in New York. Nathaniel's grip on her hand was the only thing grounding her. It was a steady, warm anchor in a sea of chaos. He gave her a look so fleeting she might have imagined it, a brief, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance, as if to say, play along. Play along with what? This was insanity. But the alternative was to snatch her hand back, to stammer that this was all a mistake, and to cement her status as a hysterical, irrelevant fool in front of the most influential people in the city. The part of her that had been shrinking and hiding all night found a strange, defiant spark. She drew in a shaky breath, lifted her chin, and offered the stunned room a small, tremulous smile. Nathaniel seemed to approve. He turned his attention back to the crowd, his voice dropping to a more intimate, conversational tone that nonetheless carried to every corner. Clara has been the intellectual driving force behind this exhibit. Her work on the Psalter is, frankly, revolutionary. He looked at Alistair again, a predatory smile touching his lips. I'm sure you were just about to give her the public credit she so richly deserves. Weren't you, Alistair? It was a checkmate. Alistair, cornered and publicly shamed, could only stammer. Yes, of course, Nathaniel. Miss Hayes. Clara. Her contribution has been invaluable. The word sounded like sawdust in his mouth. The spell was broken. The room erupted into a low, buzzing murmur. People began to move, their orbits reconfiguring around this new sun. A line began to form, people who had looked through Clara an hour ago now desperate for an introduction. Mr. Sterling, a delight to finally meet your other half. Miss Hayes, your work sounds simply fascinating. Nathaniel handled them with practiced surgical precision. He kept Clara close to his side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The gesture felt both proprietary and protective. He fielded questions, deflected inquiries, and introduced her with a possessive pride that was so convincing she almost believed it herself. She murmured greetings, shook hands, and tried to keep her smile from looking like a grimace of terror. She was an actress thrust onto a stage without a script, in a play she didn't understand. After what felt like an eternity of this surreal performance, Nathaniel leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear. "We're leaving," he murmured, his voice a private current in the public stream. He nodded curtly to the chairman of the board, steering Clara away from the throng with an authority no one dared to question. They moved toward a private exit, the same one she had been so desperate to escape through moments before. As they passed Alistair, he looked utterly broken, a man who had seen his carefully constructed world crumble in an instant. There was no triumph in it for Clara, only a profound sense of dislocation. They emerged into the cool night air of a private courtyard. A sleek black car, so silent it seemed to absorb the sound around it, idled by the curb. A chauffeur in a dark suit opened the rear door. "Get in," Nathaniel said. It wasn't a request. Her paralysis finally broke. I don't understand. What is happening? Why did you do that?" His grey eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something other than cool control. There was a flicker of something, impatience, urgency. "All of your questions will be answered, but not here." He gestured to the car. "Please, Miss Hayes, get in." Her instincts screamed at her to run, to thank him for whatever bizarre act of chivalry he'd performed and disappear back into her anonymous life. But another, more pragmatic voice pointed out that he had just single-handedly saved her from public humiliation and potentially salvaged her career from Alistair's predatory grasp. He had given her power, however illusory and temporary. She owed him an explanation, at the very least. Numbly, she slid onto the buttery leather seat. The interior of the car was like a sensory deprivation tank, silent, dark, and smelling of rich leather and ozone. Nathaniel got in beside her, and the door closed with a soft, definitive thud, sealing them off from the world. The car pulled away from the curb with a silent electric hum. They drove in silence for several minutes, the city lights sliding across the tinted windows in a hypnotic blur. Clara's heart was still hammering against her ribs. She stared at the man beside her, a silhouette in the dim light. "Who are you?" she finally whispered, the question feeling absurdly inadequate. He turned his head, and his face was illuminated by a passing streetlight. The sharp planes and angles seemed carved from granite. "You know who I am. I know your name. I don't understand why you know mine, or why you would lie to a room full of people like that." "It wasn't a lie," he said calmly. "It was a proposition." They pulled up to a towering skyscraper in Tribeca, a sleek monolith of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. A private elevator took them straight to the penthouse without a single stop. The doors opened directly into a living space that was larger than an entire floor of Clara's apartment building. The far wall was a sheet of glass, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the entire city skyline. The furniture was minimalist, expensive and impersonal. It was less a home than a monument to success. Nathaniel walked to a bar carved from a single piece of black marble and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to her. Scotch. The fumes alone were intoxicating. "My company is on the verge of a merger," he began, his back to her as he stared out at the city. "A multi-billion-dollar deal with a Japanese tech consortium. The chairman, Mr. Tanaka, is a man of traditional values. He believes a man is not truly stable, not a sound investment, until he has a family, or is, at the very least, on the path to one." He turned to face her, his eyes intense. "For the last 6 months, my personal life has been tabloid fodder. A series of meaningless, high-profile dates that make me look frivolous, unstable. It's a liability. My board is nervous. Tanaka is hesitant." Clara stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place, forming a picture she didn't like. "So you needed a fiancé." "I needed the right kind of fiancé," he corrected. "Not an actress, not a model, not another heiress. That would only feed the narrative. I needed someone intelligent, serious, respectable, someone completely outside of my world, someone unimpeachable." "And you chose me?" she asked, incredulous. "A random historian you've never met?" A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Nothing I do is random, Miss Hayes. I've been vetting candidates for weeks. My security team is exceptionally thorough." He took a sip of his scotch. "I know you graduated summa cum laude from Columbia. I know your doctoral thesis on Carolingian manuscript illumination won the Bainton Prize. I know you've been systematically undercredited and underpaid by Alistair Finch for 3 years. And I know he was about to use your discovery to secure a 7-figure donation from my own foundation, with no intention of ever giving you proper credit." The extent of his knowledge was terrifying. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her life dissected and analyzed without her consent. "So this was what? A rescue?" she asked, a note of sarcasm creeping into her voice. "This was a convergence of interests," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "I needed a credible fiancé. You needed a lifeline. I provided one. Now I'm offering a more permanent arrangement." He set his glass down. "Here is the proposition. For the next 6 months, you will play the part of my fiancée. You will attend events with me. You will be seen by the press. You will meet Mr. Tanaka. You will lend me your credibility. In return, I will provide you with things Alistair Finch never could." He began to list them off as if reciting a grocery list. "First, I will establish a private research foundation in your name with an endowment of $20 million. You will have complete autonomy. You can study whatever you want, wherever you want, for the rest of your life. Second, I will ensure that Alistair Finch is publicly and professionally disgraced for his plagiarism. The truth of your work will be known to everyone. Third, I will give you this." He walked to a safe hidden behind a panel on the wall and removed a flat, leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on the marble coffee table and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a single illuminated manuscript page. It was breathtakingly beautiful, the colors still vibrant after centuries. Clara recognized it instantly. It was the missing page from the Psalter she'd been studying, the key that unlocked the final cipher, believed to have been lost in a fire in the 18th century. "This is my life's work," she breathed, her fingers hovering over the delicate vellum, afraid to touch it. "And it will be yours," Nathaniel said. "A signing bonus. All of it is yours, Clara. You just have to say yes to being my fiancée for 6 months." He was offering her everything she had ever wanted, her dream career, justice, the missing piece of her soul's puzzle. The price was her life, her identity, her truth. It was a deal with the devil, a devil with piercing grey eyes who had already saved her once tonight. She looked from the priceless manuscript to the cold, calculating man who was offering it. The power imbalance was staggering. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a force of nature, and he wanted to use her as a shield. "And after 6 months?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "After 6 months," he said, his expression unyielding, "we have a quiet, amicable parting of ways. You walk away with your foundation, your reputation restored, and your life's work in your hands, and I close my deal. It's a simple business transaction." Simple. There was nothing simple about it. It was the most complicated, terrifying, and tempting proposition she had ever imagined. The first week of her new life as Clara Hayes, fiancée of Nathaniel Sterling, was a blur of disorientation. It began the morning after the gala. She had left his penthouse in the same silent car, clutching the leather portfolio containing the lost manuscript page like a holy relic. He hadn't touched her, hadn't offered a single word that wasn't related to their transaction. He had simply given her a new, encrypted phone and told her his assistant, a woman named Evelyn, would be in touch. Clara had walked into her own small apartment and felt as if she were entering a stranger's home. The worn armchair, the stacks of books, the chipped coffee mug, it all seemed to belong to a different person, a naive girl who had believed in meritocracy. She had stayed up all night, the manuscript page spread carefully on her desk under a soft lamp, torn between elation at possessing it and a profound soul-deep terror at the price she had agreed to pay. Evelyn called at precisely 8:01 a.m. Her voice was crisp, efficient, and devoid of warmth. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Sterling has arranged for your transition. A car will be waiting for you at 9. Please pack a small overnight bag. Your existing wardrobe will be replaced." The word replaced hung in the air, a quiet judgment on Clara's entire existence. She packed a bag with a sense of dreamlike detachment, including her well-worn copy of the Letters of Abelard and Heloise and a photograph of her and her sister, small anchors to a life that was already slipping away. The car took her not to Nathaniel's penthouse, but to a sprawling pre-war apartment on Park Avenue. It was magnificent, with soaring ceilings, herringbone floors, and windows that overlooked Central Park. It was also completely sterile. The furniture was all shades of grey, beige and white. There were no books on the shelves, no photos on the walls. It was a beautiful, empty stage. "This will be your residence for the duration of the arrangement," Evelyn explained, appearing as if from nowhere. She was a severe woman in her 50s with a razor-sharp bob and an iPad that seemed permanently attached to her hand. "It is in the same building as Mr. Sterling's secondary residence, convenient, and the security is absolute. The staff have all signed extensive non-disclosure agreements." What followed was an invasion. A team of stylists descended upon her, their measuring tapes and critical eyes dissecting her flaws. They tutted at her practical shoes and her single, modest pearl necklace. Racks of clothing were wheeled in. Cashmere, silk, and fabrics she couldn't name in colors chosen to complement her skin tone. A hairdresser and makeup artist gave her a more polished look, smoothing her naturally wavy hair into sleek lines and applying makeup that made her feel like she was wearing a mask. They were creating a character, the brilliant, elegant fiancée. It was a painstaking process of erasure. Every choice, from her lingerie to her evening bags, was made for her. They were sanding down her rough edges, polishing her into a flawless gem that could be set in the sterling crown. The psychological toll was immediate. In her own clothes, her own skin, she was Clara Hayes, a historian with a passion for the past. In these borrowed plumes, she felt like an imposter. The power imbalance was no longer just about wealth. It was about identity. Nathaniel wasn't just renting her time, he was curating her very being. Her first official duty was a small, private dinner with two of Nathaniel's board members and their wives. Evelyn prepped her for hours, providing a dossier on each guest, their business interests, their children's names, their pet projects, and, most importantly, topics to avoid. "Mrs. Albright is sensitive about her son's recent divorce," Evelyn instructed, her tone brisk. "Mr. Chen is a connoisseur of Burgundy. Compliment his choice of wine." Nathaniel arrived at her apartment an hour before they were due to leave. It was the first time she had seen him since the night of the gala. He looked at her, his eyes doing a slow, analytical sweep from her perfectly coiffed hair to the tips of her designer heels. "Good," he said, the single word of approval feeling less like a compliment and more like a confirmation that his investment was sound. He handed her a velvet box. Inside was a staggering diamond ring, a flawless, emerald-cut stone that glittered with cold fire. "Your engagement ring," he stated. "The stone has been in my family for generations. The press release will say I had it reset for you in a modern setting." She slipped it onto her finger. It felt heavy, alien, a beautiful, expensive lie. "Is there anything I need to know? About you?" she asked, the question feeling absurd. "If I'm your fiancé, I should probably know your favorite color." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I doubt Mrs. Albright will quiz you on my sartorial preferences. Just stick to the topics Evelyn gave you. Talk about your research. They will find it quaintly charming." The condescension in his tone pricked at her. He saw her life's passion as a charming accessory, a useful part of the costume he was creating for her. The dinner was an exercise in suffocating pleasantries. The board members treated her with a cloying deference that was entirely directed at the ring on her finger. They asked her about her work, and as she began to speak with genuine passion about the medieval ciphers, she saw their eyes glaze over. They didn't care, they were just ticking a box, confirming that the fiancé was as advertised, intelligent, presentable, and no threat. Nathaniel was a master performer. He would gently touch her arm when she spoke, steer the conversation back to her when it strayed, and look at her with a manufactured adoration that was chillingly convincing. He played the part of the devoted fiancé perfectly, but his eyes when they met hers were cool and unreadable. They were partners in a transaction, and nothing more. Later that night, back in the silent, empty apartment, she took off the ring and the expensive dress. She scrubbed the makeup from her face until her skin was raw. She was drowning. The deal had seemed so simple in his penthouse, her integrity in exchange for her dreams. But she hadn't understood the reality of it. The constant performance, the loss of self, the crushing loneliness of being surrounded by people but utterly, completely alone. Her only solace was the manuscript page. She would spend hours with it, losing herself in the intricate lines and faded ink, a connection to something real and true. It was the fruit of the poison tree, but it was also the only thing keeping her sane. A week later, Evelyn informed her of a new development. Mr. Tanaka is advancing his trip. He will be in New York next month. He has requested a dinner at Mr. Sterling's home, an intimate affair. The timeline had accelerated. The pressure was mounting. That evening, Nathaniel came to her apartment again. This time he wasn't dressed for an event. He wore dark trousers and a simple grey cashmere sweater. He looked almost human. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. "Tanaka's dinner is the main event. It has to be flawless. He's not like my board members. He's shrewder. He will be watching our every interaction." "What do you want me to do, rehearse?" she asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "In a manner of speaking," he replied, unfazed. "We need a story, a believable narrative for how we met, how we fell in love." He will ask. We need our answers to align perfectly. He sat down, not in one of the stiff, formal chairs, but on the edge of the sofa, closer to her. "I've had my team draft a timeline. It's in this file." He slid a sleek tablet across the coffee table. "It details a fictitious 6-month courtship. We met at a university lecture you were giving. I was intrigued by your mind. We had a series of quiet, private dates, museums, old bookshops, walks in the park. It plays into the narrative, the billionaire tired of the shallow world, captivated by a woman of substance." Clara stared at the tablet. Her own life, rewritten by a team of strangers. A fictional romance, complete with dates she'd never been on and conversations she'd never had. The manipulation was so profound, so absolute. "This is insane," she whispered. "This is necessary," he countered, his voice low and intense. "Clara, I do not fail, and I don't allow the people associated with me to fail. You wanted your foundation. You wanted justice. This is the price. We will learn this story. We will practice it. We will become it. For one night, for Tanaka, it has to be real." He looked at her, and the mask of the cold businessman slipped for a moment. She saw a flicker of the immense pressure he was under, a hint of the vulnerability he kept so carefully hidden. It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the armor. "I know this is difficult," he said, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "But Finch is already under investigation by the museum's ethics board based on an anonymous tip they received with irrefutable proof. The first part of my promise has been kept." He stood up to leave. "Read the file. Memorize it. I'll be back tomorrow. We'll start rehearsing." As the door closed behind him, Clara was left alone in the gilded cage, the tablet glowing in the dim light. He was a monster of control and manipulation, but he was also a man who kept his promises. She was his pawn, but he was also, strangely, her only ally. The psychological conflict was tearing her apart. To win her soul back, she first had to sell it completely. The rehearsals were excruciating. Nathaniel would come to her apartment every evening, and they would sit across from each other, reciting the fabricated details of their love story. It felt like studying for an exam, a cold and clinical memorization of lies. "Where was our third date?" he would quiz her, his grey eyes watching her for any hesitation. "The Frick collection," she'd answer automatically. "We discussed the brushwork in Holbein's portrait of Sir Thomas More. You said it reminded you of the ruthless efficiency of a well-written line of code. And what did I give you on our 2-month anniversary? A first edition of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. You said it was because you admired my independence of mind." Each detail was meticulously crafted to create a portrait of a perfect intellectual romance. The irony was suffocating. Their real interactions were stilted, transactional. They were two actors learning lines, but the script only highlighted the complete absence of genuine intimacy between them. Yet, slowly, something began to shift. In the spaces between the scripted lines, fragments of the real Clara and the real Nathaniel began to emerge. One evening, frustrated with the sterile recitation, she looked up from the tablet. "This is pointless," she said. "Anyone can memorize facts. That's not what makes something believable. It's the small things, the unplanned moments. He's going to ask something that's not in the script, and we're going to fall apart." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest?" "We need to actually talk," she said, feeling a surge of courage. Not as Nathaniel Sterling, CEO, and his hired fiancée, but as two people. For instance, the script says you were captivated by my lecture. What was the lecture about? He paused, caught off guard. It was about the role of female scribes in medieval scriptoriums. And what about it captivated you? She pressed. He was silent for a long moment, looking not at her, but through her, at some memory. You talked about them as if they were alive, he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. You described how they would press flowers into the pages or write notes in the margins about the cold or a child they were missing. You found the humanity inside the history. Everyone else sees old books. You see people. The observation was so astute, so deeply perceptive, that it left her speechless. It was the most anyone had ever understood about her work, and the words had come from this cold, calculating man. It was the first crack in his facade. After that, the rehearsals changed. They still reviewed the official story, but they began to improvise around it. She would ask him about his work, not the billion-dollar mergers, but the code itself. He spoke about it with a surprising passion, describing the elegance of a perfectly structured algorithm, the beauty of a system that was both complex and flawlessly logical. She saw the creator behind the capitalist. He, in turn, would ask her about her research. She brought out the digital scans of the Psalter, showing him the ciphers, explaining her theories. He listened with an unnerving focus, his questions sharp and intelligent. He wasn't feigning interest. He was genuinely engaged, his mind dissecting the problem with the same intensity he applied to a business deal. During one of these sessions, she was describing the loneliness of the monk who had created the ciphered letters. He was in love with a woman he could never have, she explained. The entire Psalter is a coded love letter, hidden inside a holy book. A lifetime of passion, all in invisible ink. A futile gesture, Nathaniel commented, his voice flat. I don't think so, she countered. He couldn't be with her, but he made sure their story would survive. He found a way to make something beautiful out of his pain. I don't think that's futile. I think it's a kind of victory. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a new depth in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been understanding, or even sorrow. The night of the dinner with Mr. Tanaka arrived like a death row sentence. Clara was a bundle of nerves, even in the exquisite, custom-made emerald green gown that had been chosen for her. The diamond ring felt like a 20-pound weight on her hand. The dinner was held at Nathaniel's penthouse. For the occasion, the sterile space had been transformed. There were flowers, soft music, and books on the shelves, her books, from her apartment, which his staff had apparently collected and arranged. The personal touch was another calculated move, but it still sent a strange pang through her chest. Mr. Tanaka was a small, elderly man with kind, crinkling eyes and a mind as sharp as a shard of glass. He was accompanied by his wife, a graceful, silent woman. They greeted Clara with formal bows, their eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, the apartment, and, most importantly, her interactions with Nathaniel. The evening was a masterclass in performance art. Nathaniel was charming, attentive, and utterly convincing. He and Clara moved around each other with a practiced ease, their hands brushing, their glances meeting at just the right moments. They told the story of their courtship, weaving the scripted facts with the genuine threads of conversation they had developed during their rehearsals. At one point, Mrs. Tanaka, speaking through a translator, asked Clara, "Mr. Sterling is a very powerful, very public man. Your world of books is so quiet. Are you not afraid of being lost in his shadow? Clara felt a moment of panic. This wasn't in the script. She felt Nathaniel's eyes on her, his body tense. She thought of the gilded cage, the erasure of her identity. And then she thought of their late-night conversations, of the unexpected respect he had shown for her mind. "Mrs. Tanaka," Clara began, her voice steady. "Nathaniel's world is vast, it's true, but my world is just as vast. It stretches back 1,000 years. It's filled with kings and queens, poets and scribes. In my world, I am the one with the power to bring lost voices back to life." She smiled, a genuine, confident smile. "Nathaniel doesn't cast a shadow. He is fascinated by the light my world casts on his." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a look of pure, unadulterated surprise on Nathaniel's face. It was quickly masked, but she had seen it. She had deviated from the plan, and instead of failing, she had soared. Mr. Tanaka beamed. He said something in Japanese, and the translator relayed. "He says he sees now. Your strength is not the same as Mr. Sterling's, but it is a perfect balance." The rest of the evening passed smoothly. As the Tanakas were leaving, the old man pulled Nathaniel aside. Clara couldn't hear what was said, but when Nathaniel returned, the tension had drained from his shoulders. "The deal is closed," he said, after the door had shut. "He called me after they got in the car. He said meeting you was the deciding factor." A wave of relief washed over Clara. "So it's over? My part in it?" "Yes," he said. He walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of scotch. He handed one to her. "You were remarkable tonight, Clara, more than I expected." "I just told the truth," she said quietly, "or a version of it." They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights glittering below them. The transaction was complete. She should have felt victorious. She had secured her foundation, her future. But instead, she felt a strange, hollow ache. The end of the arrangement meant the end of this whatever it was between them. The end of their late-night talks, the end of seeing those rare cracks in his armor. "There's something I haven't told you," Nathaniel said, breaking the silence. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead staring out at the view. "My motive for going after Finch wasn't just about securing you for this arrangement." He took a long swallow of his drink. "My grandfather was an academic, a brilliant historian. His entire career was destroyed by one man, Alistair Finch's father, who was also a powerful curator. He stole my grandfather's research, published it as his own, and blacklisted him from every university in the country. My grandfather died a broken, bitter man. The Sterling family lost its academic legacy." Clara was stunned into silence. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a vendetta, decades in the making. "Your research," he continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "The ciphers in the Psalter, they didn't just expose Finch. They proved the foundation of the theory that my grandfather was ruined for defending. By destroying Alistair, you weren't just getting justice for yourself, you were vindicating him." Suddenly, everything made sense. His obsessive knowledge of her work, the cold fury he directed at Alistair, the almost personal satisfaction he took in the man's downfall. She hadn't been a random pawn. She had been a very specific, very carefully chosen weapon. The revelation was devastating. She looked at him, at this man who had meticulously planned every move, who had used her passion and her pain as tools to settle a generational score. The fledgling sense of connection, of partnership, she had started to feel curdled into a cold, hard knot of betrayal. "All of it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Our conversations, your interest in my work, was all of it just part of your revenge plot?" He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with a conflict she had never seen before. The cool, controlled CEO was gone, replaced by someone raw and exposed. "At first," he said, his voice ragged, "yes, but somewhere along the way." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. But it was too late. The trust, as fragile and tentative as it had been, was shattered. She had been used, not just as a fake fiancée, but as an instrument of a vengeance she knew nothing about. She had thought she was playing a part in his story, but she had just been a ghost in another man's history all along. The penthouse, which had moments before felt like a stage for their shared victory, now felt like a prison cell. The air crackled with the fallout from his confession. Betrayal was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She had allowed herself to see the man behind the monster, to believe there was a glimmer of genuine connection forming in the crucible of their lies. Now she saw that too had been a manipulation. "You used me," she said, the words flat and heavy, stripped of all emotion. Every moment, every conversation, it was all a means to an end. My humiliation at the gala, my career, my life's work, they were just convenient leverage for your family's vendetta. "It wasn't like that," he started, taking a step toward her. "Not entirely." "Don't!" she snapped, holding up a hand. The fire was returning to her veins, chasing out the cold shock. "Don't you dare try to soften this. You talk about the elegance of a perfectly structured algorithm. That's what I was to you, a variable in your equation for revenge. You vetted me, you studied me, you found my exact price, and you bought me." The truth of her own words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had traded her integrity for a foundation and a manuscript. She had made a deal, and he had simply been the shrewder negotiator. The shame was suffocating. "The arrangement is over," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "You have your deal with Tanaka. I've held up my end of the bargain." She slipped the massive diamond ring off her finger and placed it on the marble bar with a sharp click. The sound was one of finality. "I'll have my things moved out of the apartment tomorrow." A flicker of something, was it panic, crossed his face. "Clara, wait. We need to discuss the dissolution. It has to be handled carefully. A quiet, amicable separation in a few months, just as we planned." "No," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "The plan has changed. Your plan. I'm done being a character in your story. You can have your PR team invent whatever narrative you want for our breakup. I don't care. But I am finished." She saw the conflict warring in his eyes. The cold-blooded strategist was battling with something else, something he didn't have a name for. "My grandfather," he began, as if that explained everything. "Your grandfather deserved justice," she cut in, her voice softening for a moment before hardening again. "But you don't get to use his memory as an excuse to become a monster yourself. You talk about Finch's father stealing a legacy. What do you think you've been doing to me for the past month? You've been trying to steal my agency, my identity, my very self, and reshape it for your own purposes. You are more like them than you realize." That struck a nerve. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He had built his life on being the antithesis of the men who had wronged his family, and she had just held up a mirror to him. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the elevator. Her legs felt unsteady, but her spine was rigid. She had never felt so broken and so powerful at the same time. "The foundation," he called after her, his voice strained. "The manuscript page. The deal stands." She paused with her hand on the button, but didn't turn around. "I know it does. You always honor your transactions." She pressed the button, and the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. "It just turns out the cost was higher than I thought." The days that followed were a study in hollow freedom. She moved back into her small apartment, which now felt both like a comforting refuge and a reminder of the person she was before Nathaniel Sterling had shattered her world. The stylists and the designer clothes were gone. She wore her own familiar sweaters and jeans, but they felt strange on her skin, as if she were a snake who had shed a layer only to find herself ill-fitting in her old one. News of Alistair Finch's downfall was swift and brutal. The museum announced an internal investigation, he was suspended, and the academic journals were filled with whispers of career-ending plagiarism. Clara felt a distant, clinical satisfaction, but the victory was tainted. It wasn't her victory, it was Nathaniel's. True to his word, the paperwork arrived via a high-end courier. Legal documents establishing the Hayes Foundation for Manuscript Studies with a board of trustees she was to appoint, and an endowment that made her dizzy. Another package contained the deed of ownership for the manuscript page. He had fulfilled his contractual obligations. She should have been ecstatic. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. But every time she looked at the documents, she saw his face, heard his confession. The foundation felt like blood money. The manuscript page felt like a beautiful scar. Her sister Chloe came over, bubbling with excitement after seeing a tabloid photo of Clara and Nathaniel at a charity event a few weeks prior. "I can't believe you didn't tell me. You're engaged to Nathaniel Sterling, and now you're not. What is going on, Clara?" Clara couldn't tell her the truth. The non-disclosure agreement she'd signed was ironclad, but more than that, she couldn't bear to voice the humiliation of the arrangement. "It was a whirlwind," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "We just weren't right for each other." Chloe looked at her, her expression full of sisterly concern. "You seem different, sadder. I thought this would be your happy ending." "There aren't always happy endings, Chloe," Clara replied, her voice weary. "Sometimes there are just endings." Clara tried to throw herself into her work. She began drafting the charter for her foundation, planning research trips, sketching out the framework for her first major project, a full-scale digital humanities project on the Psalter. But the joy was gone. The passion that had once consumed her now felt like a flickering ember. The ghost of Nathaniel Sterling and her own complicity haunted every page. He had given her the keys to the kingdom, but he had poisoned the well. One rainy afternoon, a month after she'd walked out of his life, there was a knock on her apartment door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened it to find him standing there, dripping wet, without a chauffeur or a bodyguard in sight. He wore a simple dark coat over jeans, a far cry from the billionaire in the bespoke suit. He looked tired, lost. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice flat. She made no move to let him in. "I came to—" he started, then stopped, as if the words were failing him. He, the man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, couldn't seem to articulate a simple thought. "The foundation. Have you appointed a board?" "I'm working on it," she said coolly. "And the manuscript?" "It's safe." An awkward, heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the sound of the rain against the window. "That's not why I'm here," he finally admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor before meeting hers again. His eyes were raw, stripped of their usual defenses. "You were right. About me. About what I became." He took a deep breath. "For 20 years, my entire life has been focused on two things: building my company and avenging my grandfather. I saw people as assets or obstacles. I saw everything as a transaction. I thought it was strength. I didn't realize I was just building a prison around myself." Clara remained silent, her arms crossed over her chest, a barrier against him and his words. "When you walked out," he continued, his voice low and ragged, "the victory felt empty, meaningless. I destroyed Finch, I closed the deal, I vindicated my family name, and I felt nothing. All I could think about was the look on your face when you realized I had used you, the same way Finch had used you, the same way his father had used my grandfather." He looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't see a billionaire or a manipulator. She saw a man drowning in the consequences of his own choices. "I don't know how to fix it, Clara," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion she never thought him capable of. "I don't know if it can be fixed. I just know that the world I built for myself is worthless without the things you talked about. Humanity, connection, making something beautiful out of the pain. I don't know how to do that." He wasn't making a proposition. He wasn't offering a deal. He was just confessing. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and real he had ever been with her. The weapon was laying down his arms, not in surrender, but in a plea for help. Clara looked at the man standing in her doorway, soaked, stripped of his usual arrogance, and utterly lost. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to close the door. He was dangerous. His world was a labyrinth of power plays and hidden motives, and she had barely escaped with her sense of self intact. To let him back in, even an inch, was to risk it all over again. But the historian in her, the part of her that searched for the humanity in faded ink and forgotten lives, saw something else. She saw a man reckoning with his own history, with the ghost of his grandfather and the corrosive legacy of revenge. He had built an empire, but he had hollowed himself out in the process. He had come to her, not with a plan or a proposition, but with the rubble of his own making. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "What do you expect me to do?" "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "I don't expect anything. I thought you deserved to hear it. An explanation that wasn't part of a negotiation." He ran a hand through his wet hair, a gesture of profound weariness. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who want something from me. My money, my power, my name. You're the only person who ever walked away from it." His words struck a chord deep within her. In walking away, she had inadvertently shifted the power dynamic. She was no longer the pawn. She was the one thing his billions couldn't buy. Someone who had seen the real him, flaws and all, and had judged him on the content of his character, not the size of his bank account. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 2 months, she stepped aside. "Come in. You're dripping all over the hallway." He entered her apartment, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. In contrast to his own stark, minimalist spaces, her home was filled with controlled chaos. Books stacked on every surface, maps pinned to a corkboard, the scent of old paper and brewing tea. It was a space dedicated to thought, to history, to life. He looked profoundly out of place, a sleek grey wolf in a cozy rabbit warren. She handed him a towel. "Tea?" He nodded, a look of surprise on his face, as if he'd been prepared for a fight and was disarmed by the simple offer of hospitality. As she busied herself in the small kitchen, she could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. The silence was different now. It wasn't the tense, strategic silence of their rehearsals. It was a fragile, uncertain quiet. She brought 2 mugs of tea to the small table by the window. They sat, the rising steam creating a misty veil between them. "The foundation," she said, breaking the silence. "I can't accept it, not as it is." He looked up, his expression guarded. "It's a legally binding gift. It's yours." "I know, but it feels tainted," she admitted. "It's the product of a lie, of your revenge. If I'm going to do this, it has to be on my own terms. Clean." He frowned, not in anger, but in confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm giving the money back," she said, her heart pounding at the audacity of her own words. "All of it. We're going to dissolve the foundation you created." His jaw tightened. "That's insane. That's $20 million. It's your dream." "It was my dream," she corrected gently, "but a dream built on a rotten foundation will eventually collapse. I can't spend the rest of my life building a legacy on your lies, Nathaniel. It would be a cage, just a different kind from the one on Park Avenue." She saw him wrestling with her logic, his transactional mind unable to process an act that was so completely counter to self-interest. "I don't understand," he said. "You came here and talked about making something beautiful out of pain," she reminded him. "That's what I'm going to do, but I have to do it my way. I'm going to write a new proposal for the Salter project, a clean one. I'm going to submit it to the Sterling Family Foundation, the legitimate one, the one your name is on, and it will be judged on its merits, not on me, not on you, not on any backroom deal." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "It will be a formal grant application. It will go through the proper channels. Your board will review it. And if they decide it's worthy of funding, then I will accept. And it will be a real victory, mine, untainted." It was a monumental gamble. She was betting her entire future on the slim hope that his foundation's board was more than just a rubber stamp for his whims, and that her work could stand on its own, without his thumb on the scale. She was handing all the power back, but this time it was a choice. Nathaniel stared at her, a slow, dawning realization spreading across his face. She wasn't rejecting him or his money. She was rejecting the way it had been given. She was demanding a reset, a chance to start again, not as conspirators, but as equals. She was offering him a path to do things the right way, a path to redemption. "They will say no," he said, his voice quiet. "Without my influence, the board is conservative. They prefer funding hospital wings to dusty books." "Then they say no," she replied with a shrug, though the thought terrified her. "And I'll find another way. I'll apply for other grants. I'll start smaller. It might take me 20 years, but it will be mine. My integrity is not for sale, Nathaniel. I thought it was for a moment. I will never make that mistake again." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. She had just dismantled his entire worldview. He solved problems with money and power. She was insisting on a solution that involved process, merit, and a high probability of failure. Finally, he looked back at her, and the conflict in his eyes had been replaced by a reluctant, grudging respect. It was a look that held more genuine feeling than all the manufactured adoration he had shown her during their charade. "All right," he said, his voice raspy. "Submit your proposal. I will instruct my assistant to ensure it is passed to the board. But I will not interfere. I will not speak to them about it. I will not influence their decision in any way." He gave her a wry, sad smile. "You will almost certainly fail." "Probably," she agreed, a small smile touching her own lips for the first time. "But it will be an honest failure, and that's better than a corrupt victory." He stood up, placing his empty mug in the sink. The brief, fragile moment of connection was over. They were back to being two separate people from two different worlds. At the door he paused. "Clara." "Yes?" "Thank you," he said simply. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken truths. After he left, Clara stood in her quiet apartment, the scent of his rain-soaked coat still lingering in the air. She felt terrified and exhilarated. She had just willingly thrown away a fortune, a guaranteed future for a principal. She had refused the ending he had written for her, and had chosen to face an unwritten page, with no idea what the next chapter would hold. It was the most reckless and the most liberating decision of her life. The weeks that followed were a quiet, grueling battle. Clara poured every ounce of her energy into the grant proposal. It became her singular focus, a way to channel her anxiety into productive work. She worked from dawn until long after midnight, her small apartment transformed into a command center. Books and papers covered every surface, and the walls were a tapestry of timelines, charts, and scanned manuscript pages. This was not just a request for funding, it was a declaration of independence. Every word had to be perfect, every citation immaculate, every part of the budget justified down to the last cent. She was no longer just Clara Hayes, the researcher. She was the founder, director, and sole employee of a project she had willed into existence. She consulted with digital humanities experts, with conservationists, with legal scholars to ensure her methodology was unassailable. She wrote and rewrote the narrative, framing the Psalter not just as a historical artifact, but as a nexus of art, cryptography, musicology, and human emotion. She was making her case to a board of strangers, and she had to do it with nothing but the power of her own intellect. There was no contact from Nathaniel. He kept his word. The silence from his world was absolute. Sometimes, in the dead of night, a sliver of doubt would creep in. Had she been a fool? Had she let pride get in the way of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? She would look at the photograph of her and Chloe, a reminder of a simpler time, and then at the high-resolution image of the Psalter page on her screen, and she would push the doubt away. This was the only way. Finally, after a month of relentless work, The proposal was finished. It was over 200 pages long, a testament to her passion and her meticulous scholarship. She printed a single, perfect copy, bound it in a simple black cover, and mailed it to the official address for the Sterling Family Foundation. The act felt small, anticlimactic. She had launched her life's work into the void. All she could do now was wait. The waiting was a special kind of torture. Days turned into weeks. She tried to start on other projects, but her mind was consumed by the fate of the proposal. She heard nothing. The silence deepened, becoming a heavy blanket of probability. He had been right. She was going to fail. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Sterling was fighting his own battles. In the aftermath of his confession at Clara's apartment, he had returned to his life, but the world looked different. The thrill of the Tanaka deal was gone. The ruthless satisfaction he used to take in outmaneuvering his rivals felt hollow. Clara's words echoed in his mind. "You are more like them than you realize." He began to look at his own empire with new eyes. He saw the human cost of his relentless efficiency, the fear in his employees' eyes that he had always mistaken for respect. He saw the sterile emptiness of his own life, a life built on transactions, not connections. He did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the university archives and pulled the files on his grandfather's academic career. He read the letters, the accusations, the desperate failed appeals. He saw the slow, painful dismantling of a good man's life. And for the first time, he didn't just feel the cold fire of vengeance. He felt the profound human tragedy of it. He understood what Clara meant when she said she saw people, not just history. When Clara's proposal arrived at the foundation, it was, as he predicted, met with skepticism. The executive summary was passed to him by his assistant, Evelyn, with a dismissive note. Another academic vanity project. The board will reject it in committee. The old Nathaniel would have agreed. The old Nathaniel might have even felt a grim satisfaction at being proven right. But he looked at the title, The Argon Psalter, a digital reconstruction and cryptographic analysis, and he saw Clara. He saw her passion, her integrity. He saw the woman who had thrown $20 million back in his face for a principle. He had promised not to interfere, and he wouldn't. He would not call the board members. He would not tell them to approve it. But there was nothing in his promise that said he couldn't ensure they gave it a fair hearing. He called the foundation's director. "The Hayes proposal," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. "I want it presented at the full board meeting next month. Not in committee, the full board, and I want the applicant to present it in person." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Sterling, that is highly unusual for a first-time applicant." "Make it happen," Nathaniel said, and hung up. It was a power play, yes, but he wasn't dictating the outcome. He was just opening the door. Clara would have to walk through it herself. A week later, a formal cream-colored envelope arrived at Clara's apartment. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was an invitation to present her proposal to the full board of the Sterling Family Foundation in 2 weeks' time. The terror was immediate and overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. This was her chance. A single hour to make her case. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing, rehearsing her presentation until she could do it in her sleep. She was not just arguing for a grant. She was arguing for the value of her entire world, the world of quiet study, of historical empathy, of finding meaning in the whispers of the past. The day of the presentation, she chose her outfit with care. Not the designer armor from her time as his fiancée, but her own clothes, a simple, well-tailored grey dress, her modest pearl necklace. It was the uniform of a scholar, not a socialite. It was who she was. The boardroom was an intimidating cathedral of dark wood and polished steel on the top floor of Nathaniel's corporate headquarters. The board consisted of 12 people, men and women with powerful, impassive faces, and at the head of the long table, silent and unreadable, sat Nathaniel. He gave her a single brief nod as she entered, nothing more. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but as she set up her laptop, a strange calm settled over her. She looked at the faces staring at her, people who dealt in billions of dollars and global markets, and she realized she had something they didn't. She had a story. She began to speak. She didn't just present data and budgets. She told them the story of the lonely monk. She showed them the hidden notes, the pressed flowers. She made them see the humanity trapped in the vellum. She explained how the digital project wouldn't just preserve an old book, but would create a new way for people to connect with the past, to understand the timelessness of love, loss, and hope. She spoke with a passion that filled the sterile room with warmth and life. When she finished, there was silence. The board members looked at each other, their impassive masks cracking slightly. She had reached them. The chairman, a stern-looking man named Robert Albright, the same man from the disastrous dinner party, cleared his throat. "Miss Hayes, your passion is evident, but this foundation has a mandate toward projects with a wide, tangible impact. Medical research, educational infrastructure. How can you justify a multi-million-dollar investment in a single medieval book?" It was the kill-shot question, the one she had been dreading. Before she could answer, Nathaniel spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but resonant. "Robert," he said, his eyes not on Clara but on the chairman. "This company, this building, this foundation, it's all built on a single idea. That innovation is the engine of progress. We invest millions in code that will be obsolete in 5 years. We fund buildings that will one day crumble." He paused, and his gaze shifted to Clara, a look of profound, open respect in his eyes. "Miss Hayes is proposing something different. She's working with technology that is 700 years old and is still speaking to us. She is not just preserving the past. She is investing in the things that are timeless: empathy, art, the human story. What is the tangible impact of that? I don't know. But I would suggest that a foundation that has forgotten the value of those things has lost its way." He leaned back in his chair. "The decision is yours." It was the most eloquent, powerful defense she could have ever imagined. He hadn't told them what to do. He had simply reminded them of who they were supposed to be. He had used his power not to force their hand, but to guide their conscience. The vote was taken. It was 7-5. The proposal was approved. The aftermath of the board meeting was a quiet revolution. The news of the grant sent a ripple through the academic community. Suddenly, Clara Hayes was no longer the disgraced Dr. Finch's overlooked assistant. She was the director of the most innovative manuscript project in the country, a scholar with a vision and the resources to make it a reality. She leased a modest office space near Columbia University, a sunlit room that she quickly filled with books, computers, and a large whiteboard that was soon covered in her sprawling notes. She hired a small, brilliant team: a data scientist, a paleography expert, and a graduate student with a knack for coding. The Hayes Foundation was real. It was hers, and it was built on a foundation of truth. She and Nathaniel did not see each other. There was an unspoken agreement that for her work to be truly independent, there had to be distance, but the nature of the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the tense, transactional silence of their arrangement, nor the wounded, angry silence of its aftermath. It was a silence of respect, of two people giving each other the space to rebuild. Occasionally, their worlds would intersect in small ways. She saw his name in the news when Sterling Industries launched a new, ethically sourced manufacturing initiative, a move praised by human rights groups. He was changing, redirecting his immense power toward more constructive ends. He was making something new out of the rubble. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year after the disastrous gala, she was working late in her office. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a soft knock on her door. It was Nathaniel. He was dressed simply in a dark sweater and trousers, holding a long, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, a small, almost shy smile on his face. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Nathaniel," she said, her surprise genuine and warm. "Come in." He looked around the office at the organized chaos, the hum of the servers, the focused energy of her small team, visible through the glass partition. "This is impressive," he said. "It's real." "It is," she said, a quiet pride in her voice. "We're making good progress. We broke the last of the ciphers last week." "I read the article in the Times," he said. "Congratulations." The awkwardness that had defined so many of their early encounters was gone. In its place was an easy, comfortable quiet. They were no longer the billionaire and the historian, the puppet master and the pawn. They were just a man and a woman who had been through a fire together and had come out changed on the other side. "I brought you something," he said, holding out the package. "A housewarming gift of sorts for the foundation." She took it, her curiosity piqued. She carefully unwrapped the paper. It was a framed document, but it wasn't a rare manuscript or an expensive piece of art. It was a simple, typewritten page, yellowed with age. A letter. She read the first few lines, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a letter from Nathaniel's grandfather, written to the university president a year after his dismissal, pleading his case one last time. It was filled with a scholar's quiet dignity, a profound sadness, and an unshakable belief in the truth of his research. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her eyes misty. "It was in his files," Nathaniel said, his voice soft. I thought it belonged here, a reminder of why this all matters. Not the revenge, but the resilience. The idea that truth eventually finds a way. It was the most thoughtful, meaningful gift he could have possibly given her. It was a piece of his history, an acknowledgement of their shared journey, and a tribute to the principles they had both, in their own ways, fought to reclaim. She looked up at him, and her smile was genuine, luminous. "Thank you, Nathaniel. It's perfect." He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the last of the walls crumble. There was no calculation, no strategy. There was only a profound, quiet vulnerability. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I spent months trying to write a story for us, a fiction for other people. I was wondering if you would be interested in starting a new one, a real one, with no script, no agenda, and no audience." He wasn't offering a deal. He was asking a question. The power was balanced. The page was blank. Clara thought of the lonely monk, hiding his love story in a holy book, hoping it would one day be found. She thought of Nathaniel's grandfather, fighting for his truth against impossible odds. And she thought of her own journey, from an invisible girl at a party to a woman who had stared down a titan and had not only survived, but had won on her own terms. Their story was complicated, messy, and built on a foundation of lies. But it had led them, improbably, to a place of truth. She stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, and placed her hand on his arm. "I think," she said, her voice full of a hope she hadn't felt in a very long time, "I would like that very much." Clara's journey from an ignored academic to a woman who commands her own destiny is a testament to the strength that lies within us all. It's a story about how the deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to the most unexpected forms of redemption, and how true power isn't about wealth or status, but about owning your own voice. If this story of betrayal, power, and finding your own truth resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who loves a story of emotional depth and dramatic twists. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the complex, messy, and beautiful corners of the human heart. Thank you for joining us on this journey.